If we could pull, test, check. If we could pull back together, that'd be great. I'm having some mic troubles. Check. Maybe you can bring me a handheld or something. Great. You can throw it. No, John. We're going to have some time for some Q&A and discussion in just a couple of minutes. But think about these problems. But I said there were 4 because I think there's one problem that is actually deeper than these 3. I think these 3 problems all relate to a deeper problem. Have you ever asked yourself, why don't we address these problems? Like when you think about the election last year, did you hear anybody really talking about these 3 deeper problems? We have a lot of surface issues, but we very seldom go down and really address the deeper questions. We keep trying to deal with symptoms without dealing with diseases. And that got me thinking, what is kind of the engine or the fuel source or the drivetrain? What is it that makes the machine go around? As I worked on this, and I was doing this research, I was looking for the right term to describe it, and I ended up seizing on the idea of a framing story. What I mean by a framing story is a story that tells us who we are, where we're from, where we're going, and what we're about. It's the story that tells us what's going on here so we figure out what to do. Now you can think about it like this. Your body, maybe you've never thought of yourself this way, but your body is a civilization of about 60 trillion cells. And I hope we have some math majors here. There are over 6 billion people on the earth. So that means 6 trillion is 1,000. Is that 1,000 times bigger than 6 billion, right? So 60 trillion would be 10,000 times better. Is that good math? Somebody can tell me later. Anyhow, so it's like you have 10,000 times the number of cells in your body as there are people on the planet. Something like that anyway. But all of those 60 trillion cells are united in the story of you. Your story of your life is what unites those cells. So, 7 years from now, all 60 trillion of those cells will have died, and there will be 60 trillion new cells replacing them. If you're me, it'll be 70 trillion. But anyway, you will replace, but they're still part of the story of you. And in the same way, we can say that all of the people in a culture, in a nation, or on the planet itself are united. They're like cells united in one larger story. But the problem is, where do we get the story? How do we figure out what the story is? And that's where we really have, I think, the deepest problem of all. Because the place we get those stories is usually our religions, our faith communities. But I think when we look at these problems in our world today, here's what we have to conclude. The world's religions are failing to provide a story that can help us heal the machine, fix the machine, turn the machine from a suicidal trajectory to a more sustainable and wise and regenerative trajectory. And when I say the world's religions, I mean our own religion too. Now, I don't mean Jesus, but you understand Jesus isn't the same as Christianity. You understand the difference, right? And all of our religions, Christianity, 33% of the world's population. Islam, 21% of the world's population. Hinduism, mid-teen % of the world's population. Buddhism, Judaism, Sikhism, all the other religions of our world. None of them are stepping forward and offering us a story that helps us deal with these problems. In fact, very often, our religions are making these other 3 problems worse. And at best, very often, our religions are distracting people from these problems and getting them to worry about another list of problems that are maybe important to some people, but in the big scheme of things, can we be honest? It won't be the end of the world if we have women preachers. But it will be the end of the world if we blow each other up. And how much energy is spent on fighting intramural religious arguments. Now, tomorrow you're going to hear statistics from Dave Kinnaman about how young people feel about church. And maybe this helps explain why so many people just feel like, why bother with this religion stuff? It doesn't address the real issues that make a difference in our world, and very often it just makes things worse. Now, when I started really thinking about this issue of a framing story, what I started realizing is it doesn't matter if it's Christianity, it doesn't matter if it's Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, Pentecostal, it doesn't matter. And it doesn't matter if it's Islam or Hinduism or Judaism. You usually can find our religions telling one of four stories. One is the story of domination. This story says, we're not safe unless we're in control. Who is we? We as people of our religion, or people of our race, or people of our economic system, or people of our political party, or people of our nation, or people of our civilization. We're not safe unless we're in control. And when you're in a domination story, you tell the story about your struggle for power and how you got it and how you kept it. And that kind of a story, that domination story, gets told in 1,000 ways. It gets told in fairy tales to children. It gets told in blockbuster movies. It gets told in many, many ways. It gets told in history books. Which stories are included and which stories are left out. But we find ways to build inside of ourselves a story that we're only safe if people like us are in control. Then there's the revolution story. That's the story the people not in control tell. They say, we're not safe until they're out of control, until they're out of power. And then we tell the stories of how we got those bad guys out of power, or all the bad things that they've done to us and why they ought to be thrown out. And we tell those stories in 1,000 ways. We tell it on radio talk shows every day, and we tell it in movies, and we 1,000 ways to tell stories of revolution. Now, another very powerful story that religions play a big part in, what happens when you're in control but things aren't going so well? Then you tell a purification story or a scapegoating story. The Nazis did this. Once they got into power, when they were trying to get into power, they told the revolution story. Those people in the Weimar Republic are a bunch of jerks. If we're in power, everything will be good. And sure enough, they succeeded. They got into power. But then once they were in power, everything wasn't perfect. So what did they do? The only problem is those Jews and those Jehovah's Witnesses and those homosexuals and those gypsies. They had four main scapegoating people. And they loved to scapegoat those people. And so religions do a great job of finding little minority groups to shame and scapegoat, to get all of our anxiety onto them. I mean, look, let's face it. This is what Christians do in the United States. Whatever your opinion on the issue of homosexuality, can you agree it's kind of silly to blame gay people for the problems of divorce in heterosexual marriages? Mm-hmm. I mean, do I get a small amen on that?
Amen.
I mean, this to me is just an amazing example of socially acceptable scapegoating. It's happening with Latinos. There's a lot of places in the country, you can say anything you want about a Mexican. It's their fault. And it happens a lot of times towards black folks. It happens a lot of times towards people, whichever political party you're not in. All kinds of ways to scapegoat people. And that purification narrative is very, very popular. And then is the isolation narrative. When none of the other ones work, what religious groups are very good at doing is they say, you know what, the only way we're safe is if we can get away from all those other people, because they're going down and we're going up. So let's create a little huddle and isolate a little network, and let's get in the bubble, and we'll have our own TV stations and our own radio, and we'll do everything just for our inside group because we want to isolate. That's the only way to be safe. And what became so interesting to me as I started evaluating these stories is I realized how similar this was to Jesus' day. I mean, these were the stories that were going on in Jesus' day. The domination story, that was the story of the Roman Empire. And the Sadducees and the Herodians were the two political parties in Jesus' day that were signed on with the Romans. They said, let's work with the domination story. And then the revolution narrative, that was the Zealots. They were the perfect example of that. We would call them terrorists, but they were revolutionaries. And they said the only way that we're going to be safe is if we kill enough of those Romans and have a violent revolution. And obviously the purification story, that was the